The bookshelf of yesteryear was a small used bookstore facing the street in the Oak Park district of suburban Chicago. The late afternoon winter sun streamed into the store, gilding the spines of old books with golden light. Behind the register counter, Evelyn Morrison carefully turned the pages of an old poetry collection, checking its condition. Evelyn was a woman with a gentle, ever-present smile. Her brown hair hung simply to her shoulders, and her thick cardigan blended perfectly with the bookstore's atmosphere. For her, this small shop was a dream come true. After majoring in literature in college and working for several years in a corporate publishing division, she had been drawn to the charm of old books and opened her own store 5 years ago. The store's doorbell rang, and Evelyn looked up. "Grandma. You're early today." Margaret's back was straight, her white hair perfectly set, and her classic tweed coat reflected her elegance. As Evelyn hurried over to greet her, Margaret placed a light kiss on her granddaughter's cheek. "My bridge game with Henrietta ended early. And I have something for you." Margaret took a small wrapped box from her handbag. When Evelyn opened it, inside was a delicately bound 19th century poetry collection. "Grandma, this is..." "It's a first edition of Austin Dobson. The one you were looking for last month, right?" Margaret smiled with satisfaction. "I remembered an old friend owned it." Evelyn embraced her grandmother with gratitude. Margaret was the widow of the late Edward Morrison, who had become a legend in Chicago's real estate industry. After her husband's death, she had wisely managed their assets and was now known as a wealthy woman with over $5 million in assets. Margaret lived in a luxury apartment near Evelyn's store. Evelyn visited her grandmother almost daily, helping with shopping and doctor's appointments, and most importantly, sharing conversation time, which Margaret valued most. "I'll make some tea." Evelyn headed toward the kitchen space in the back. "How are you feeling today?" "Not bad. The blood pressure medication seems to be working." Margaret sat down in an old leather chair in the store. "Have you heard from Daniel and Susan?"
Do you know some people earn over $10,000 a month just by posting Reddit stories on YouTube? No face, no voice, just a laptop. I do it too. Link below if you're curious.
Evelyn's expression clouded slightly. "Mom called last week. They're both coming at the end of this month. For another consultation about asset management, I suppose," Margaret said coolly. Evelyn's parents, Daniel and Susan Morrison, were busy with their lives as a senior manager at a major airline and a successful corporate lawyer, respectively. They visited Margaret only a few times a year, and each time, the conversation turned to asset management and investments rather than her health. "Is Rachel coming too?" Margaret asked. "Yes, she's coming directly to Chicago from New York." Evelyn's sister Rachel worked as a marketing manager for a luxury fashion brand in New York. Her glamorous lifestyle on Instagram and her embodiment of the latest trends attracted many followers. Rachel's visits were also rare. Margaret took a sip of tea and said, "You're so different from them. You understand what truly matters." Evelyn smiled, but complex emotions swirled inside her. Among her family members, she was the only one who didn't pursue a high-powered career or material success. For that reason, especially her parents considered her to lack ambition. "I'm satisfied with my choices," Evelyn said softly. The two spent a quiet afternoon together. Margaret spoke about memories from her youth, the struggles of married life, and the real estate empire she and her husband had built together. As always, Evelyn listened attentively, occasionally asking questions, absorbing her grandmother's wisdom. "Edward always used to say, 'Wealth is a responsibility,'" Margaret reminisced. "Money itself has no value. What matters is how you use it." When it was time for Margaret to leave, Evelyn walked her to the entrance. "You have a doctor's appointment tomorrow afternoon, right?" Evelyn confirmed, and Margaret nodded. "Yes, but don't worry. Joseph will drive me," Margaret mentioned her longtime chauffeur. "You should keep the store open." She took Evelyn's hand and said, "I'm truly grateful to have you." Those words carried something beyond mere politeness. The following Tuesday, early in the morning, the store phone rang. When Evelyn picked up the receiver, she heard the distressed voice of Betty, Margaret's caregiver. "Evelyn, hurry. Your grandmother. I think it's a stroke. I've called an ambulance." Evelyn dropped the book she was holding and rushed out of the store without even putting on her coat. When she arrived at the hospital, the doctors were already working desperately. However, 3 hours later, Dr. Carter entered the waiting room with heavy steps. "Ms. Morrison, I'm sorry." 3 days later, the Morrison family gathered at Margaret's law office. Daniel and Susan were in somber black attire, but their eyes seemed to be thinking of something else. Rachel hid her face behind large sunglasses, occasionally pressing a handkerchief to her eyes. Attorney Jonathan Clark cleared his throat and spread out the documents. The reading of the will began. After the legal preamble, Clark reached the important part. "I bequeath 80% of my assets, including cash, stocks, bonds, and real estate, to my beloved granddaughter, Evelyn Morrison." Silence fell over the room. "Of the remaining assets, I bequeath 5% each to my son Daniel Morrison and his wife Susan Morrison, and 10% to my granddaughter Rachel Morrison." When Clark finished reading, Daniel stood up. His face was red with anger. "This is absurd. Mother would never make such a will." Susan followed her husband in protest. "Margaret had cognitive issues recently. When was this will made?" "Last October," Clark answered calmly. "Margaret was fully competent and signed in the presence of 2 witnesses and a notary." Rachel removed her sunglasses and glared at Evelyn with red, swollen eyes. "You manipulated her, didn't you? You deceived Grandma." Evelyn gripped the armrest of her chair with trembling hands. "I did no such thing. It was Grandma's wish." "Be quiet." Daniel raised his voice. "You isolated Mother and made sure only you were close to her. And now you've got your reward." Clark tried to stop the argument, but Susan said in a cold voice, "We'll contest this in court. We'll have her doctor testify about Margaret's mental state." It all felt like a nightmare to Evelyn. The family that had been peaceful just days ago was suddenly at odds. She remembered her grandmother's last words, "The truth always finds the light, Evelyn. Believe in that." 3 weeks later, official legal documents arrived in Evelyn's mailbox. Her parents and sister were suing her, claiming undue influence and exploitation of assets from a dementia patient. With trembling hands, Evelyn picked up the phone and contacted her friend, attorney Alexandra Cohen. "I need help," she said tearfully. "My family is suing me." Alexandra Cohen's law office was on the 23rd floor of a high-rise building in downtown Chicago. The view from the window overlooked Lake Michigan, which would normally be soothing, but Evelyn was in no state to appreciate it. "This is clearly a frivolous lawsuit," Alexandra said as she reviewed the complaint. In her mid-40s, she was known as an attorney with sharp intelligence and cool judgment. "All their claims are based on circumstantial evidence and speculation." Evelyn answered, holding her coffee cup with shaking hands, "But how could I have manipulated Grandma? We just cared for each other." "That will be the core of our defense." Alexandra settled deep into her chair. "We need to prove Margaret's mental state and the nature of your relationship. Can we get testimony from her primary physician?" Evelyn's face clouded. "Dr. Carter might not be very cooperative. I think my parents have already contacted him." "I expected that," Alexandra said while taking notes. "Then we'll gather testimony from the notary and the will witnesses, plus people who knew Margaret's daily life." That evening, as Evelyn was preparing to close the store, a regular customer, Martha, burst in excitedly. "Evelyn, look at this." She held out a local newspaper. The front page had the headline, "Family Feud Over Wealthy Woman's Estate," with photos of Evelyn and Rachel side by side. The article was written from Rachel's perspective, painting Evelyn as a cold-hearted granddaughter who took advantage of her grandmother's weakness. Oh my. Evelyn was at a loss for words. Over the next few days, the situation rapidly deteriorated. Local news sites picked up the story, and Rachel was giving interviews. In front of the camera, she tearfully claimed, "My sister isolated Grandma and kept her away from the family. Then she took all the assets while Grandma was confused." People Evelyn had never seen before began stopping by her bookstore, either out of curiosity or to cast judgmental looks. Some regular customers continued to support her, but business had clearly declined. Alexandra called, unable to contain her anger. "They're trying to manipulate public opinion. But in court, facts win over emotions. I've just secured testimony from Betty, Margaret's caregiver." Meanwhile, Daniel and Susan had multiple meetings with Dr. Carter. They were also contacting the manager and security guards at Margaret's apartment building, trying to gather testimony that Evelyn prevented other family members from visiting. Rachel became even more aggressive, developing a narrative on her social media about fighting for Grandma's justice. Through her fashion industry connections, several well-known blogs and influencers began posting in support of her claims. Evelyn retreated to her store, avoiding going out as much as possible. Her close friend Laura often visited with groceries and encouraged her. "You've done nothing wrong," Laura emphasized. "Rachel's followers are just believing what she says. But the truth will eventually come out." Alexandra and Evelyn prepared their counterattack. They gathered detailed testimony from the notary present on the day Margaret created her will, the law office staff, and the 2 witnesses to the will. All confirmed that Margaret was lucid and fully capable of making decisions. Evelyn also contacted Margaret's neighbors and friends, gathering evidence of the truth about her relationship with her grandmother and proof that she visited regularly. Among these, the testimony of Henrietta and Eleanor, Margaret's bridge partners, was particularly valuable. "Margaret was always proud of her granddaughter," Henrietta testified. She often talked about Evelyn in particular. In her words, "Evelyn is the only family member who understands true value, not just money." However, Dr. Carter's testimony proved problematic as expected. The doctor stated that Margaret Morrison occasionally showed signs of confusion and, while avoiding a specific diagnosis, suggested that there may have been cognitive decline typical of elderly patients. "This testimony is too vague," Alexandra explained to Evelyn. "But it could still influence the jury. We need concrete evidence of Margaret's daily decision-making ability." 2 weeks before the trial, Evelyn visited her grandmother's apartment to clean it out. It was a task she had been avoiding for a long time. Sorting through the room filled with memories was painful. While clearing the bookshelf in the study, Evelyn found a thick envelope wedged between her grandmother's favorite historical novels. On the envelope, in her grandmother's elegant handwriting, was written, "To Evelyn, for when you need it." Inside was a small voice recorder and a note. The note simply said, "If my intentions are ever questioned, listen to this." With trembling fingers, Evelyn pressed the play button on the recorder. Margaret's calm voice filled the room. "Evelyn, if you're listening to this, then things have happened as I anticipated. I've known the true nature of our family for years. Even what they would do for money." The recording continued, with Margaret explaining in clear judgment her reasons for the property inheritance to Evelyn and her disappointment with the rest of the family. More surprisingly, conversations with Daniel, Susan, and Rachel during their visits to Margaret's home were also recorded. "I used the security system in this house to record whenever they visited me," Margaret's voice explained. "They sometimes talk thinking I can't hear." Evelyn gasped. The recorder captured conversations of her parents and Rachel planning to take Margaret's assets for themselves. They even discussed plans to contact Dr. Carter to obtain proof of confusion. Still holding the recorder, Evelyn called Alexandra. "I found evidence." "Grandma, she knew everything." Alexandra was cautious. "We need to verify if these recordings are legally valid. Bring them to my office." Evelyn hugged the recorder to her chest and looked out the window. Dark clouds spread across the sky, but beyond them, a thin light was visible. "Grandma, you protected me until the end," she whispered. The Cook County Courthouse building stood with particular dignity among Chicago's cityscape. The neoclassical building, with its history of over 100 years, with its massive columns and staircase, symbolized the solemnity of justice. On the day of the trial, Evelyn headed to the courthouse with Alexandra. As expected, reporters had gathered around the courthouse. Rachel's social media strategy had worked, making this inheritance dispute a topic covered in local news. "Head up, be confident," Alexandra gently pushed Evelyn's shoulder. "You've done nothing wrong." Entering the courtroom, the gallery was already full. In the front, Daniel and Susan sat with their lawyer. Daniel wore a stern expression, staring straight ahead, while Susan pretended to be calm, but her eyes held a light of assured victory. Rachel was dressed in conspicuous black mourning attire and didn't forget to occasionally press a handkerchief to her eyes for effect. Around her sat colleagues from the fashion industry and young women who appeared to have come to support her through her social media. "All rise," came the call as Judge Hamilton entered the courtroom. In her 60s, she was known as a strict judge with years of experience. The plaintiff's attorney, Richard Davenport, stood up first. In a refined tone, he presented concerns about Margaret Morrison's mental state and claims that Evelyn had isolated her grandmother. Mrs. Morrison suffered from cognitive decline in her later years, Davenport told the jury. "It's hard to believe that a frail elderly woman in such a condition would voluntarily create a will that excludes most of her family." Dr. Carter was called first as a witness. He testified about Margaret's health condition, peppering his testimony with technical terms. Mrs. Morrison occasionally showed problems with short-term memory and confusion, the doctor said. Symptoms consistent with cognitive decline seen in elderly patients. Alexandra stood for cross-examination. "Dr. Carter, have you ever formally diagnosed Margaret Morrison with dementia?" "No, I made no formal diagnosis." "Did you ever determine that Mrs. Morrison had cognitive impairment severe enough that she couldn't understand her financial situation?" "I made no such determination." Alexandra calmly pursued. "Dr. Carter, is it true that you had frequent contact with Daniel and Susan Morrison several months before the trial?" Dr. Carter shifted uncomfortably. "They consulted me about her health condition as family members." Next to take the stand was Rachel. She delivered a perfectly rehearsed performance. Tearfully, she spoke about her special bond with her grandmother and claimed that Evelyn kept Grandma away from the family. "Whenever I tried to visit, my sister always interfered," Rachel said with a trembling voice. "Grandma was confused, and my sister took advantage of that." Many in the courtroom looked at Rachel with expressions of sympathy. Her performance was effective. By afternoon, it was the defense's turn. Alexandra calmly stood and called the notary and witnesses who had prepared Margaret's will. They all testified that Margaret was lucid and fully capable of making decisions. Next, Margaret's longtime friend Henrietta took the stand. Margaret was clear-headed until the end, she stated firmly. She understood the true nature of her family. However, the cross-examination by the plaintiff's attorney was harsh. He used Henrietta's advanced age to cast doubt on her own memory. Finally, Evelyn herself took the stand. Restraining her trembling hands, she honestly spoke about her relationship with her grandmother and how she had cared for her. "I loved my grandmother," Evelyn said quietly. "She taught me many things. We simply wanted to spend a lot of time together." Davenport's cross-examination was thorough. He looked for inconsistencies in Evelyn's testimony and sometimes asked questions suggesting she had exerted influence over Margaret. "According to Henrietta Clark's testimony, you met with your grandmother every day, but you yourself testified that it was several times a week." Evelyn was confused. I didn't see her every day. Sometimes we just talked on the phone." A faint murmur spread through the courtroom. Alexandra decided it was time to present the final evidence. She nodded to Evelyn and stood up. Your Honor, I would like to submit one last important piece of evidence. She took the envelope she had received from Evelyn. I submit this as Exhibit A. These are conversations recorded by Margaret Morrison during her lifetime. She recorded conversations with visitors to her home to document her mental state. The plaintiff's attorney jumped up. Objection. This evidence wasn't disclosed beforehand. Your Honor, Alexandra responded calmly, this evidence was discovered last week. We immediately notified the opposing party and provided a copy. After hearing from both attorneys, Judge Hamilton ruled, the evidence is admitted. Play the recording. Silence spread across the courtroom as the audio began to play. The first voice heard was Margaret's calm tone. Today is September 15, 2023. I, Margaret Elizabeth Morrison, wish to record that I am in a completely sound mental state. This recording is being made in case my decision-making capacity is ever questioned. Next, a recording from another day played. Rachel's voice was clearly audible. So Mom, get the new lawyer to prepare those asset management documents for Grandma quickly. Susan's voice followed. But will she agree? She's been getting stubborn lately. That doesn't matter, Daniel's low voice declared. I've already talked to the doctor. He'll prepare documents proving she's confused. Rachel's voice sounded again. If Evelyn doesn't interfere, we can transfer Grandma's assets to our names. It would be easier if she weren't around, Susan's cold voice said. Why is she so troublesome? The courtroom was completely frozen. The color drained from Rachel's face, and her parents were rigid like statues. The recording continued. Margaret's clear voice stated her final wishes regarding her property, expressing her deep love for Evelyn and her disappointment with the rest of the family. My decision is not emotional, Margaret's voice was strong. It is based on years of observation and recognition of who truly respected me as a person. Evelyn never sought my fortune. She listened to me and valued my past and experiences. She was the only family member who did so. When the recording ended, the courtroom was wrapped in silence. Judge Hamilton declared a temporary recess. In the hallway, Rachel confronted Evelyn. Her eyes burned with anger and shame. Recording is illegal. It's wiretapping, she shouted. Evelyn replied calmly, Grandma had the right to record her own conversations in her own home. She saw through all of you until the end. Susan and Daniel were consulting with their lawyer in a panic. Their expressions showed disturbance and fear. Their plan had crumbled before the audio evidence. Evelyn stood quietly in a corner of the hallway with Alexandra. You did well, the lawyer patted her shoulder lightly. Margaret remained sharp until the end, didn't she? Evelyn gazed out the window. The evening sun broke through the clouds, creating a warm band of light on the courthouse's stone floor. Thank you, Grandma, she whispered to herself. You protected the truth until the end. When the recess ended, the trial resumed. The atmosphere in the courtroom had completely changed. Before re-entering, the lawyers had held an emergency meeting in the judge's chambers, and tension hung in the air as everyone awaited the results. Judge Hamilton entered with a solemn expression and took her seat. Her gaze was sharp, particularly when looking toward the plaintiff's area where Daniel, Susan, and Rachel sat. After considering the admissibility of the recordings, the judge said quietly, I determine that these recordings made by Margaret Morrison in her own residence are legal under Illinois state law. Therefore, they are admitted as evidence. The plaintiff's attorney, Davenport, stood up and tried to say something, but the judge raised her hand to stop him. Furthermore, a handwritten recording permission document from Margaret Morrison has been submitted by the defense attorney. This proves that she clearly intended to record conversations in her home. Alexandra stood up and said, Your Honor, there are additional recordings. Margaret Morrison regularly recorded conversations with family members who visited her home over the past year. These records prove the clarity of her mental state and show that she fully understood and intentionally decided on the contents of her will. The judge considered for a moment and nodded. Admitted as evidence. Play the recordings. The recordings played one after another demonstrated Margaret's clear mental state. She stated accurate dates and logically discussed topics ranging from asset management to current events. Particularly impressive was a monologue recorded a few days before the will was created. "I have lived a long life and learned many things," Margaret's calm voice echoed in the courtroom. "The most important thing is to observe people's actions, not their words. Daniel, Susan, and Rachel look at my assets, but Evelyn sees me as a person. She listens to me and respects my life experiences. This is why I am leaving the majority of my property to Evelyn. This is not an emotional decision, but a logical judgment based on years of observation." The next recordings included scenes where Daniel and Susan tried to persuade Margaret to transfer asset management rights to them. Margaret calmly refused, and their irritation was captured. There was also a recording of Rachel's visit, showing how she was more interested in exploring the apartment's interior and value than conversing with her grandmother. The courtroom was completely silent. Daniel and Susan hung their heads, and Rachel clutched a handkerchief with trembling hands. Her makeup was ruined by tears, and she could no longer maintain the perfect image of a victim. After all the recordings were played, Judge Hamilton spent the entire afternoon listening to final arguments from both sides. The plaintiff's attorney made a last attempt at resistance, but his claims sounded hollow in the face of the audio evidence. Finally, the judge announced she would deliver the verdict the next day and closed the court. The next morning, Evelyn headed to the courthouse again with Alexandra. There were more reporters than the previous day, as media interested in the unexpected development of this inheritance dispute had gathered. However, their focus had changed. The initial headline, "Granddaughter Manipulates Grandmother," had been replaced with, "Recordings Reveal the Other Side of Inheritance Battle." In the courtroom, Daniel, Susan, and Rachel in the plaintiff's seats appeared smaller than the day before. Many of Rachel's fashion industry friends had disappeared, and the gallery was now filled with local citizens and law students. Judge Hamilton entered and began reading the verdict. "This court finds that Margaret Elizabeth Morrison's will is valid and that she had full decision-making capacity when creating it. There is no evidence of undue influence or exploitation of assets from a dementia patient as claimed by the plaintiffs. Rather, the evidence presented shows that the defendant, Evelyn Morrison, had a sincere relationship with her grandmother and was dedicated to her care." The judge paused and continued. "Furthermore, this court has deep concerns about the plaintiff's actions. The submitted audio evidence suggests that the plaintiffs may have attempted to improperly acquire Margaret Morrison's assets. Therefore, this court requests an investigation by the prosecutor's office regarding the possibility of fraud and perjury." Murmurs spread through the courtroom, and the judge called for quiet before continuing. "In conclusion, Margaret Morrison's will is valid, and property distribution should proceed according to its contents. The plaintiff's claim is dismissed. Additionally, the defendant's attorney fees and court costs shall be borne by the plaintiffs." Judge Hamilton finally stated, "This trial was more than an inheritance dispute. It is a victory for truth and justice, and reaffirms the importance of respecting the wishes of the deceased." As the judge left the courtroom, Evelyn embraced Alexandra with tears. "It's over," she said in a trembling voice. "You won," Alexandra smiled. "No, Margaret won." As they left the courtroom, reporters surrounded Evelyn. The previous hostile questions had disappeared, and now they sought a new narrative of the brave granddaughter who protected her grandmother's wishes. Evelyn gave only a brief statement and did not answer their questions. "I loved my grandmother. She was a wise and thoughtful woman. I just wanted to respect her wishes. I have no further comments." Halfway down the courthouse steps, Evelyn saw her parents and Rachel hurrying away, surrounded by lawyers. Their posture was no longer proud but beaten down by shame. Evelyn called out to them. "Daniel, Susan and Rachel turned in surprise. Their expressions mixed fear and hostility. "Grandma loved you," Evelyn said quietly. "But you betrayed her trust yourselves." Rachel tried to say something, but Susan grabbed her arm to stop her. The three left without saying anything. Alexandra placed her hand on Evelyn's shoulder. "Now what will you do?" Evelyn looked up at the sky. Through the winter clouds, a ray of light broke through. "First, I'll go back to the store. Then I want to do something for Grandma." "What do you have in mind?" "Yes," Evelyn smiled. "I'm thinking of establishing a reading foundation named after Grandma. She loved books and knowledge. I think it's my role to continue that legacy." The two walked down the courthouse steps and onto the street. The cold winter wind caressed their cheeks, but to Evelyn, it felt like the breath of a new beginning. "Thank you, Grandma," she whispered in her heart. "I won't waste your teachings." On a spring afternoon 6 months after the trial, Evelyn was opening the door to her bookstore, now renamed Margaret's Bookshelf. The interior had changed significantly. The once narrow space had expanded to include the adjacent section, with a reading corner for children and a small event space for local writers. Evelyn smiled as she looked around the store. The trial's outcome had a significant impact on the community. Initially vilified by Rachel's social media strategy, Evelyn had gained community support after the recording evidence was revealed. The Chicago Tribune had published an article last month with the headline, "The Margaret Morrison Foundation, Changing the Community Through the Power of Books." The foundation Evelyn established had begun providing reading programs for children in low-income areas and reading services for the elderly. The aftermath of the trial had also affected the plaintiffs. Daniel and Susan received fines and community service sentences for perjury, and their professional reputations were severely damaged. Daniel lost his position at the airline, and Susan was demoted from partner at her law firm. Rachel also lost her standing in the fashion industry, and her social media followers decreased dramatically. As Evelyn continued reading Margaret's diaries, she discovered how far-sighted her grandmother had been. "Wealth can be a blessing or a curse depending on how it's used," her grandmother had written. "True richness lies not in money, but in honesty and compassion." One rainy Wednesday afternoon, the store's doorbell rang, and Rachel entered. She was far from her former flashy clothes and perfect makeup, dressed plainly. Evelyn stopped arranging the bookshelf and looked at her sister. "Evelyn," Rachel said anxiously. "May I talk to you?" They sat in the cafe space in the back. Rachel stared at her cup, searching for words. "I came to apologize," she finally said. "What I did is unforgivable." Evelyn silently waited for her sister to continue. "I was greedy," Rachel continued. "I was jealous. Jealous that you and Grandma had a special relationship. I was pursuing superficial things and lost sight of what truly matters." Evelyn placed her hand over Rachel's. "Rebuilding our relationship will take time." "I know," Rachel nodded. "But if you'll give me a chance to start over." The following week, Evelyn received a letter from her parents. It contained words of reflection and apology. "We were wrong," Daniel had written. "We didn't understand the true value of what Margaret left behind." Evelyn replied by inviting them to the store. After closing every Sunday, she began what she called family time, a small gathering. The first few meetings were awkward, with superficial conversation, but gradually the ice began to melt. 3 months later, in the summer twilight, Evelyn stood before Margaret's grave. She placed her hand on her grandmother's marble tombstone and quietly spoke to her. "Grandma, you were right. Family is complex and imperfect. But in the end, what matters is truly respecting each other." While arranging the bouquet she had placed on the grave, she continued, "Rachel quit her fashion job and started writing children's picture books. My parents are beginning to change too. Dad retired and started volunteering for a local business support program, and Mom is providing free legal consultations for people in vulnerable positions. The wind gently caressed Evelyn's hair, as if her grandmother were responding. Your legacy wasn't the money, was it? She smiled. It was the importance of living with honesty and dignity. Evelyn left the cemetery and began walking toward Margaret's bookshelf. The warm sunset illuminated her back, casting a long shadow in front of her. The shadow seemed to be showing her the path to the future. When she returned to the store, Rachel was helping arrange the shelves. Her parents were in the cafe space, planning a community event. Their expressions no longer showed the former greed or coldness. Evelyn stood at the entrance, observing this new family. They were still on the path to healing, but they had taken a definite step. Margaret's legacy was not just property, but a lesson in the true meaning of family. Grandma, keep watching, Evelyn whispered in her heart. And then she walked toward her family.